over the engine deck if the turret was installed. This is the four-cylinder power plant that we removed from the tank. It had a total power output of approximately 39 horsepower. This engine represented state-of-the-art in internal combustion technology. The reliability of the tank, coupled with its reasonable ammunition supply, would allow the tank to operate out to a radius of about 35 miles. This was far in excess of the larger tanks that were available during World War I.
Despite the effort the Allies put into these mobile fortresses, the Germans lagged behind in designing and implementing tanks.
That was smart because tanks are offensive weapons, and for the most part on the Western Front, Germany was on the defense. The World War I tanks were useless in defense.
As significant a technological accomplishment as the tank was, its impact was limited, not because it wasn't effective, but because no one knew how to exploit it. Tactical use of the tank within a limited battle or skirmish hadn't yet been fully conceived because the tank was such a new concept. Only in 1918, with the end of the war in sight, did a coordinated tank assault contribute to pushing the Germans back out of France. Still, the tank was an important new weapon that held great promise for visionary military leaders. Combined with an infantry assault that could hold on to enemy territory, the tank's aggressive drive across the battlefield would prove not to be only tactical, but also strategic. Decisive, not just in an individual battle, but as part of an overall plan of attack to permanently defeat an enemy. But its greatest military contribution would be realized in the next world conflict. Tank was actually the code word, short for water tank, that the British used for early armored vehicles such as the Mark I, produced in secret during the first years of the war. World War I tech will return on Modern Marvels. The first war in which air superiority played a role in tactical, if not strategic thinking, was World War I. The machines that led to this new concept of warfare included the observation balloon, the Zeppelin, and most importantly, the airplane, an engineering amalgam of aerodynamics and the internal combustion engine. Low-tech observation balloons up to 200 feet long and made of rubberized cotton could be sent up near the front. On a clear day, they could provide a 14-mile panorama and a view of enemy encampments. One or two observers could be positioned in the wicker basket below the balloon.
They were especially used on the Western Front by the Germans, and very effectively so. They'd put them up behind the lines, but high enough to where they could see the Allied lines without having to worry about flying over the lines. They were connected to the ground with telephone or telegraph lines so they could immediately communicate.
Trench warfare effectively eliminated horse-mounted cavalry reconnaissance because there were no flanks to skirt in order to observe the enemy. The ability to view the enemy from an observation balloon was now vitally important. The Zeppelin was an improvement on the observation balloon. It was essentially a series of compartmentalized air sacs filled with hydrogen, held together by an aluminum frame and attached to an engine. It was maneuverable and capable of speeds approaching 70 miles an hour.
They were built in a way that if the engine cut out, a mechanic could crawl outside and work on the engine and crawl back inside. It's every bit as complex as an ocean liner, but flies a whole lot higher.
The Zeppelin had been invented in 1900. By the start of the war, Germany had specialized combat Zeppelins. They flew them at night and above the range of artillery fire. At first, they were just for reconnaissance, but in January 1915, the first Zeppelin bombing run was made on England.
The bombing was inaccurate to the extreme. There really was not an understanding of what aerodynamics did to bombs as they fell, so they pretty much went wherever they wanted to. The Zeppelins were never decisive, and in economic terms, they were a huge waste of money because they took an awful lot to build and maintain, and the results they returned were infinitesimal.
They were also a danger to the crew. Zeppelins were full of buoyant but highly flammable hydrogen. If something were to shoot the Zeppelin with an incendiary bullet, the whole thing could flame up and crash. The biggest threat to the Zeppelin would be the airplane, which would ultimately fly higher, faster, and better than any dirigible. It was just 10 years old and hardly more than a kite when the war began. But within 4 years, the airplane would be one of the greatest technological accomplishments to emerge from the war.
The initial aircraft in World War I were flimsy, slow, they couldn't fly very high, and they tended to fall apart. If you put them in a dive, the wing would come off. They just weren't very sturdy. But very quickly, as people saw the military capability, they started building sturdier aircraft with bigger engines that were more powerful, that could carry weapons.
Like balloons, planes were used mostly in conjunction with cameras and made their greatest wartime contribution as reconnaissance craft. One of the earliest reconnaissance planes used during World War I was the Blériot, a single-wing, one-man plane with a 50-horsepower engine. The entire plane weighed around 800 pounds and had no weapons. Many early reconnaissance pilots were ex-cavalry, who no longer had as significant a role to play on the ground.
They began taking rifles, pistols, up to shoot at one another, and began taking hand grenades, small bombs, artillery shells, even rocks to drop on people on the ground, just because they were aggressive. This led ultimately to the development of specialized fighting aircraft, some intended as bombers, others intended as fighters. The goal of the fighters was always to shoot down the reconnaissance aircraft.
The challenge for a pilot was how to shoot at a target without damaging his own plane. A machine gun right in front of the pilot provided easy aim down the nose of the plane, but resulted in a shot-off propeller. Side-mounted guns were another option, but they could be awkward and hard to aim. Finally, Dutch inventor Tony Fokker figured out a way to aim a gun down the nose and have it shoot through the path of the propeller without actually hitting the blades. The best solution is called an interrupter gear. As the propeller swings across the gun, it interrupts the machine gun from firing until the propeller passes, and it fires again. Fokker figured out a method that used a mechanical lever. When the propeller spun across it, the gun stopped firing. The first true combat aircraft using Fokker's interrupter gear was the German Fokker-Eindecker, a lightweight single-wing aircraft capable of speeds approaching 85 miles per hour.
Pursuit aircraft is what they call them. The pursuit aircraft, all you got to do is swing your airplane toward the enemy and fire the machine gun. Now, this sounds romantic, but basically this is murder. What you're trying to do is sneak up on an enemy while they're busy taking pictures and shoot him in the back with your machine gun.
The men in the trenches grew familiar with the buzz of aircraft flying above the front.
You see them up there fighting? Never fun for people shooting each other, but such as it was a show of its own, like a bullfight in Mexico, I guess.
Dogfights created a demand for stronger, lighter, faster aircraft. Engineers looked to save an ounce of weight on an aircraft that was mostly canvas and wood.
The wings, for instance, on a lot of them are hollowed out pieces of wood, and they would hollow out all the wooden frame members they could just to make them as light as they could. And you look at it initially and you think they're only saving ounces, but over the entire aircraft they're saving several pounds, maybe even hundreds of pounds by the time it's all done.
Plane engines also went through a swift evolution as pilots pushed their machines to heights approaching 25,000 feet.
Just taking the engine from an 80-power engine that spins round and round and round to a huge 400 horsepower engine with 12 cylinders popping up and down inside, this is a major achievement.
One of the most famous fighters was the Sopwith Camel, named for the slight hump visible near the cockpit. It had a 130 horsepower rotary engine with cylinders arranged in a circle rather than the more familiar straight line. Both the propeller blades and the engine rotated around the shaft of the propeller.
This cooled the engine, but it created a tremendous gyroscope force. So the plane was enormously maneuverable if you turned in the direction of the spin of the engine. If you tried to turn the other way, it didn't do very well. But if you were a superb pilot, it was extraordinarily maneuverable. It needed to be because the German army had come up with